Hey everyone, this is Katrina with SEARAC. Thank you for joining our community call. We're going to give folks about 2 to 3 minutes to jump on before we get started. In the meantime, feel free to familiarize yourself with the GoToWebinar interface. For folks that are super excited to download our report, you can see that in the handout section, there is a PDF version of the report as well as a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation. But again, we'll get started shortly. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hi everyone, this is Katrina with SEARAC. Thank you for those that have been dialing in early. We're going to give folks another minute or two to hop on. But for those that are with us, thank you for joining our community call. As I mentioned earlier, for folks that are excited to download our report, you can check out the handout section of GoToWebinar. There's a PDF version along with a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation. But we'll give folks another 1 or 2 minutes and then we'll get started. Thank you. Hi everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started since we have quite a packed presentation today. So thanks again for joining us for our SEARAC February community call to launch our much anticipated groundbreaking report, Southeast Asian American Journeys, a national snapshot of our communities. This report has been a year in the making. And we have a number of partners to thank, and we're really excited to share it with everybody today. Before we get started, we just wanted to do some brief introductions and introduce you really to the SEARAC as well as the Advancing Justice Los Angeles team, which is the team that is hosting this webinar and also were critical in shaping this report. So first there's me. I'm Katrina Dizan-Mariategui, the Director of National Policy at SEARAC. I'll be the main moderator for this presentation. We also have Gina Lay, our new field associate at SEARAC, who's going to be helping with technical assistance. We also are happy to have Sina Sam, who is actually transitioning in to be our new field director, but she's also playing a dual role in that she was one of the stakeholders that we engaged from her association and affiliation with the Khmer Anti-Deportation Advocacy Group out in Washington. And then finally, we have June Lim with Advancing Justice Los Angeles. And it's really June that did much of this data analysis and data crunching, all these beautiful graphs you see in the report. That's all thanks to her hard work. So we really want to acknowledge her as well. Later on the call, we'll also be introducing you to our speakers, which are key community stakeholders that were really critical in helping to inform this report. And we're going to be opening the floor to them to give them a chance to share some of their input as well as some of their insights in terms of the best way to use this resource in their communities. In terms of logistics, all attendees should be placed on mute. But if you do want to say something specifically in the Q&A portion, there is the ability to type in a question, or you can raise your hand using GoToWebinar, and we can unmute you if that's something you'd like to request. Feel free to ask questions and comments throughout the webinar, and we'll definitely try our best to respond to them. But the majority of the questions, specifically as it pertains to the report, we'll try to save for the end of the webinar. And then finally, if you are exploring the GoToWebinar panel, as you can see in the handout section, you are able to download resources. And for this particular webinar, the Southeast Asian Journeys Demographic Profile Report is in PDF format, so you can download it there. You guys are actually the first to access this report, so exciting. And you can also download a PDF of this PowerPoint if you're interested in kind of reviewing the data that we review through this presentation. So with that, we just like to kick off our community calls with a quick poll. We would love to know from folks on the call, what part of the country are you joining us from today? So is it the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest, the South, or other? And we'll give folks a few seconds to put in their responses. Okay, everyone, let's give folks maybe like 10 more seconds, and then we'll close out the poll, and then we'll see what folks share. All right, let's see what we have. Cool. So about 40%, almost half, are joining us from the West Coast, a good proportion from the East Coast, followed by the Midwest, 5% from the South, and 7% from other. So thank you everyone for representing and showing up. For our next question, we would like to ask, how many SEARAC community calls have you attended in the past? Is it your first time? Have you attended 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more? So we'd be curious to see if there are any veterans that follow us regularly. So we'll give folks a few minutes to dial it, to answer the question, and then we'll check out what people responded. Okay, let's give folks maybe another 10 seconds. All right, let's see what we got. All right, wow. Almost 50% of you guys are brand new and are joining us for the very first time. So we're really excited to have you with us. About a quarter have joined 1 call before, about 16% of 2, and then 11% are 4 or more. So for those that regularly join our calls, we are very appreciative. And for those of you that are new, we do hope to continue to see you in future community calls as well. And then for our last poll question for this section, we would love to ask, in what capacity are you joining us today? And our options are, we'd love to know if you're from a community-based organization, a foundation, if you're a researcher or a student, if you're an individual or community member, or if you're with a national organization. So we'll give folks a few seconds to fill that out, and then we'll see what we got. Let's give folks a few more seconds. And we apologize if your affiliation was not listed. We actually ran out of options. So if you'd actually be interested in typing it in and messaging it to us, we would love to know that data as well. So maybe a few more seconds, and then let's close it out and see what we got. All right. So it looks like a good majority are from a CBO or an individual community member. Wow, 20% are actually from a national organization, about 14 to 15% are researcher student, and we have some foundation folks on the line as well. So welcome to all of you. We hope that this report would support you in your work in the number of different capacities and hats that you wear. So to get started with the presentation, we just wanted to give folks a brief background about this report and kind of how it came to be. As many folks on the line know, one of the major struggles in the Southeast Asian American community is oftentimes the stories and narratives of this community is often hidden under the broader model minority myth umbrella. This is largely due to the fact that there is not a lot of disaggregated data when it comes to issues that matter to our communities. So the idea of this report was that, we really wanted its purpose to be to tell the story of Southeast Asian Americans through the use of disaggregated data, specifically looking at their journey from their resettlement 45 years ago to today in the present. We're hoping that this report would be helpful in a number of different avenues, including folks that are doing grant writing, and that it could inform things such as program planning, targeting audiences, and the work and the services you provide. And then finally, we're hoping that it's also a resource for those that do policy and advocacy to show where the community is still growing, some of the challenges that they still face, but at the same time, also highlighting stories of resilience and overcoming some of these barriers. In terms of the outcomes, we're hoping what we find is this report would increase awareness and community advocacy around a number of key issues, particularly when it comes to a number of audiences. So first is community organizations, where it sounds like most folks on the call are actually coming from. The second is policymakers, so just making sure that they have that data and that they're informed when they're creating laws and policy change. And then finally, for those that do grant writing, we do also hope that this is a resource for foundations and other types of funders, so that it can inform how we resource these communities for long-term sustainability. In terms of the process of how this report came about, we definitely worked with a number of partners and stakeholders. And in the next slide, I will give a shout out to some of the folks that we partnered with to get their feedback on, what are some policy recommendations we should be highlighting? What are some of the key data points we want to be researching that would be helpful for us to know? And in addition, we also did some outreach to the community for those that wanted to submit stories, their families' narratives, pictures from their communities to help shape the story. Because at the end of the day, we know that it's not just really the data, but it's really the stories from our communities that changes the hearts and minds of those that read this report. And then finally, after getting that initial phase of community engagement and story collection, SEARAC, together with Advancing Justice Los Angeles, worked together to collect the data, draft the policy recommendations, and work with the designer to put this report together. In terms of the geographic scope, we do have a large portion of the report that features national data. But in addition to that, as informed by some of our stakeholders, it also highlights a few states with sizable Southeast Asian American populations. So as you see, we also feature data on California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Texas, and Washington. Much of the data comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, including the Decennial Census and the American Community Survey. And because census data is limited, we also pulled from other data sources as well. And I want to say that we also recognize that this list of states is by no means comprehensive. We recognize that there are states where Southeast Asian populations are growing tremendously. And this report is really just the beginning. So we're hoping that in the future iteration of this report, we see this list of states even grow. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, this project would not have been possible without a number of key partnerships. In conjunction with Advancing Justice Los Angeles, we want to really thank the countless community members and stakeholders that supported with, just giving their input on the different data pieces, sharing their stories, their perspectives. The logos on the screen is just a small snapshot of the different organizations that we want to thank for giving this input. We also want to give a shout out to the Coulter Foundation for funding this project, with supporting with the vision and really giving us that guidance. Again, another special shout out to Advancing Justice Los Angeles for the research and data collection. The Stakeholder Advisory Committee, which was comprised of 14 organizers, advocates, academics, direct service providers coming from 6 different states. And then finally, to the broader Southeast Asian American community, but in particular to the 25 individuals who agreed to be interviewed for quotes, submitted their photos, and allowed their quotes to be utilized through the report. We are honored and really, really grateful for your input. So next we want to review some of the key findings, and I'll try to just breeze through it quickly because you can really find most of this in the executive summary as well as through parts of the report. But in terms of the national data, we know that there are currently over 2.5 million Southeast Asian Americans living in the country. And this population comprises about 14% of the entire Asian American population. We know the Southeast Asian American population has grown by almost 40% between 2000 and 2010, which is nearly 4 times the average rate in the US. And in this chart, I thought was really interesting, highlights the key states where we see exponential growth throughout the country. So although the populations might be small still, you could see that the rate of growth has been quite big in the past decade. We also have some data around Southeast Asian refugee arrivals. So we know that the initial wave of refugees who resettled into the US, we know that a majority of them were from Vietnam and arrived between April to December in 1975. And soon after, under the Indo-Chinese parole program, there was a significant increase in the number of refugees from all over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. After the enactment of 1980 Refugee Resettlement Act, as you can see in the chart, we saw a huge increase exponentially in the arrival of refugees. And we know that until the late 1980s, Southeast Asian refugees composed more than half of all persons seeking refuge in the United States. But the numbers of refugees from Southeast Asia entering under the status has decreased since the mid-1990s. So we all know that the 1980 Refugee Resettlement Act was really pivotal to the arrival of Southeast Asian Americans into this country. And I want to say that that is one of the historical legacies of this community. It is because of this community's needs and the United States recognizing that need that these policy changes were enacted. We also have data around green card holders. So we know that until 1998, a large majority of lawful permanent residents among Southeast Asians were from changes from refugee to green card holder status. And since then, the main pathways to come here on a green card has diversified to include a shift to use of family-based immigration as well as employment methods. We know that nearly 21,000 Southeast Asian Americans immigrated to the US in 2017, which is a 95% increase. Oh, actually, and 95% of whom actually arrived on a family-based visa petition. We also have data on deportation. So as folks know, right now there's a lot of fear in the community when it comes to the Trump administration's targeting of Southeast Asian refugees, particularly now with what we're seeing in the Lao and Hmong community. The number of Southeast Asian Americans deported to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam basically more than doubled between 2015 to 2016, as well as in 2017 to 2018. Over 95% of the 223 deportations to these countries in 2018 were actually from Cambodia and Vietnam. And we know that deportations due to aggravated felonies disproportionately affect Cambodian and Vietnamese immigrants In comparison to those from countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, despite the fact that these top countries are the top countries of immigrants who are deported from the United States. But in terms of rates of deportations for aggravated felonies, the rates are still much higher in the Southeast Asian American community. In the area of economic justice, we know that across multiple indicators, the Southeast Asian community still continues to fare worse on average. Close to 1.1 million are low income, including almost 500,000 who live in poverty. Across the board, all Southeast Asian ethnic groups also have lower per capita incomes than the average. In the area of housing, this was interesting because SEARAC actually doesn't tackle a lot of housing policy, but we actually found that among the Southeast Asian groups, they have lower than average rates of home ownership, with the exception of the Vietnamese community, which is at a rate of about 65%, who are around the average rate of most of the US population. However, when you look at Southeast Asian American folks with mortgages, about 43% are more likely to be housing cost burden than the average. So housing cost burden means that more than 30% of your income actually goes to pay housing costs. So even if we know that Vietnamese Americans, for example, have high rates or average rates of home ownership, we know that they're more burdened compared to the average US population. We also know that regardless of housing tenure, Southeast Asian ethnic groups have larger average household sizes compared to the US population. So that was just a snapshot of some national data that we were able to find. And again, you can look at the report for more detailed information. But we definitely wanted to pause there and ask another poll question. We were curious to know, of the national data presented, what did you find the most interesting or the most compelling? Was it the population growth data, the refugee arrivals data, the green card applications data, ICE removals, the economic justice data, or the housing data? And we'll give folks a few seconds to respond, and we'll see what people said. All right, let's give folks maybe 10 more seconds. All right, let's see what people said. Okay. All right, so definitely a majority of you feel like the ICE removals data was the most interesting, which definitely makes sense with what we're seeing with the Trump administration targeting. Almost 30% found the housing and economic justice data interesting, followed by the population growth data, the green card data, and then the refugee arrivals data. So thank you everybody for sharing that. We always like to know if the data points we're researching resonate with the community. And then I'm just gonna go very, very quickly with just some key state data points that we wanted to uplift before inviting our panelists to share out. So first is from California. So I know a majority of folks on the call are actually from the West Coast. So in California, we know that over 900,000 Southeast Asian Americans live in the state. It's home to the largest population in the country, and the population is growing more than average. One of the data points that we explored and were able to find for this particular state was data around leading causes of death. So we found that 1/4 of deaths among Southeast Asian Americans in this state in particular were due to cancer, and 18% of deaths among Southeast Asian Americans were actually due to heart disease. This is a data point that was interesting because we actually weren't able to find it in other states. And we would be interested to hear from folks if this is something that they are seeing in their own communities. For Massachusetts, Massachusetts is the 5th largest population of Southeast Asian Americans in the country. The state is home to the second largest population of Cambodian Americans in particular. And we know that the Southeast Asian population grew by 25% from 2000 to 2010. In this area, we looked at data around limited English proficiency, or at least for the purposes of this report out. We know that over 90% of Southeast Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home, with Vietnamese being the 7th and Khmer being the 8th most commonly spoken language at home among English language learner students in the state of Massachusetts. Then we have Minnesota. I know we have a number of folks from the Midwest. Minnesota is home to the third largest population of Southeast Asian Americans, about 115,000. It's the second largest population of Hmong Americans basically reside in this state. Nearly 30% of Southeast Asian Americans in this state have neither completed high school nor passed the GED. And we know that about 20% of Southeast Asian Americans hold a bachelor's degree or higher, which is actually a rate that's less than half of the 43% of Asian Americans as a whole who do. So again, data to combat the model minority myth. For Texas, the Southeast Asian population in this state is growing more than 2 times the average. So we are seeing tremendous growth in the state of Texas. For this state, we highlighted data on home ownership. So we know that Southeast Asian Americans at about 72% actually have higher rates of home ownership than average. And Texas average is about 64%. And we know that across all Southeast Asian ethnic groups, more than half are actually homeowners, which on the surface really does sound impressive. But again, if you look closer at the data, we know that among those with a mortgage, Southeast Asian Americans at a rate of about 36% have a higher rate than average of being housing cost burdened compared to all other racial groups. So again, we know that even if a number of folks in our community own homes, they're still struggling to pay their mortgage at the end of the day. We then look finally to the state of Washington. For Washington, over 81,000 Southeast Asian Americans live in the state. It's home to the 4th largest population in the country. Among the Southeast Asian groups, it's home to the 3rd largest population of Vietnamese and Cambodian Americans and the 4th largest population of Lao Americans. The data we chose to highlight for this state, for just the purposes of this PowerPoint, is data on uninsured rates. And we see here, which is trends that really mirror what we're seeing on a national level as well, is that Southeast Asian Americans have higher than average rates of uninsurance, specifically in the Vietnamese community, and they have the highest proportion at about 15%. So to wrap up the state data portion, we just wanted to poll folks again. We would be curious to know, of the snapshot of state data that we presented, what do you think was the most surprising to you? Was it the leading causes of death data in California, limited English proficiency data in Massachusetts, educational attainment in Minnesota, home ownership rates in Texas, or uninsured rates in Washington? And we'll give folks a few seconds to respond, and we'll share out the responses. All right, let's give folks maybe 10 more seconds. All right, let's see what the responses say. All right, so it seems like a lot of folks were really interested in the data on leading causes of death in California, as well as home ownership rates, which I actually think makes a lot of sense. Even for me, that was interesting because it's not data that usually SEARAC has on hand, so that was really helpful to know. A good number were also interested in educational attainment data, followed by uninsured rates, and then limited English proficiency rates. So thank you everybody for sharing and weighing in. So with that, we would love to now transition over to really, I think, is the highlight of this call. We are going to be introducing some of our speakers. to give their thoughts, basically about the data in this report, some ideas they have for using it. And we really just want to thank them and acknowledge them for their partnership. So first we have Jeanette Yip of Houston, who is the Executive Director of BPSOS. We have Sina Sam, who is an organizer with Khmer Anti-Deportation Advocacy Group based out of Washington. And Sina is also transitioning into our new field director, so we're really excited about that as well. We also welcome Kaying Yang, who is Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Coalition of Asian American Leaders in Minnesota. And finally, we'd like to welcome Vimala Phongsavan, who is a board member at the Laotian American National Alliance. She also works with the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, or CPC for short. So thank you, ladies, for joining us on this call, and we really look forward to some of the insight you could provide. So I'd like to kick things off real quick with an initial question around some key reflections you might have on the data that was shared. So I would love to hear from each of you to let us know, basically, of the data you read in the report. What did you find the most exciting, and are there, I guess, what potential do you see in this report? And if there's any particular things that you read that you found most compelling. And I would love to invite you all to respond to this, particularly using your different perspectives from the different organizations you're with and from the different roles you play. So Sina is an organizer from Washington, Kaying as an advocate from Minnesota, Jeanette as a direct service provider from Texas, and Vimala from the perspective of a national organization. So let's kick it off. And I'm just going to choose at random. I'd love to invite Kaying to kick things off, if you would love to share any thoughts on that initial question.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and everyone for giving me this opportunity to be on this panel. It's really an honor to be able to reflect on this data together. I guess the information is not surprising, and mainly because in Minnesota, we have always said that the Southeast Asian American community is the largest Asian Pacific American community here in the state of Minnesota. So many people actually know a lot about Hmong, Lao, Vietnamese, and Cambodians here in the state of Minnesota. So I'm really happy that we're one of the states that was highlighted in this Snapshot report. I'm also pleasantly surprised that you have chosen education attainment as something to highlight from Minnesota. This morning, I just came back from our legislative session. There was a hearing on raising the per pupil funding for English learners, and despite the fact that we've been in the United States for 45 years, that there's still a second generation or maybe third generation of young people who are still placed in English learners program, which is something that we have been working very hard on to understand how to change those policies, because on one sense, we feel that we are no longer the new arrivals, and so our children should not be tracked into English learners. On the other hand, we know that English language programs are civil rights, and we want to uphold that, but we want to at least use this kind of data to shape policies that would make programs much more rigorous, even for EL learners, and that we want our policymakers to really highlight the assets that we bring, right? Because this also means that there's a lot of multilingual learners within our community, and that is something that we should embrace as a community that has been here for 45 years. I don't see it as a weakness that we don't speak English that well. I think it's an asset that we speak other languages just as well. I think it becomes a problem when we don't speak our native language well and we don't speak English well either. And I think that's why you see the data which is kind of gloomy, right? That there's larger numbers of people who only have high school degrees, but not postgraduate degrees, right? Or higher ed degrees. So I think that's an area that we still need to work on. But that area is not working at the post-secondary. It's really K through 12. What is happening at K through 12 that is not helping our children become college and career ready, right? And that I think this is a problem. And I think for someone like me who's been working on this on community development for several decades, I'm a little bit worried that I think while the population growth is great, that we haven't really moved the pendulum very much in some ways. And how do we work even more collaboratively together to ensure that our collective community is also improving across the nation, right? In some of these data points. So for those reasons, I think this is very timely. I know that I would use this data because it's very hard to gather data and to do a good analysis of it. And so when you have it in one place, I think it helps me as an advocate to pull the data together to make the case, right, for equity funding or just to be included at any equity table, right, any table that talks about inclusion and diversity. Sadly, for a state like us, when we talk about racial equity, again, it's always this black and white. And so we're, as Asian Americans, we're always fighting to be at the table. And I think this kind of data will help, make the case, even though, like you said, storytelling is very powerful. Unfortunately, the people that we're trying to convince, they need this kind of data. So having the data is really important. In that sense, I'm excited to be able to work with everyone on trying to figure out, what is our vision for the next 5 to 10 years? What is that going to look like? And what are we expecting out of the 2020 census? Will the data have changed some? I don't know. These are some questions that I'm still kind of pondering. I think, did you want me to answer all 4 or just the first one, compelling data, Katrina?
Oh, it's okay, Kaying. Let's start with the first one for now.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing that, specifically with your expertise and all the advocacy you do in Minnesota. And I think it does make a lot of sense in terms of, how we can be working collectively to make sure that all communities, or all Southeast Asian American communities, are having access to more equitable policy changes.
Yeah.
So from that note, I would love to hear next from actually Jeanette, right? So now shifting from, looking at a viewpoint as an advocate using this data, maybe when they talk with their state and local lawmakers, as Jeanette, for you that works as a direct service provider, how do you see the data from this report being useful in the work you do? And was there any data that you found particularly compelling?
Yeah, thanks, Trina. This is just a fabulous report. I think that although some of these numbers are not surprising because we've all done, grant writing proposals, and data is what is needed in order to show, the foundations and your funders that there is, a huge population that has a huge need, and so. One of the things is that it's disaggregated, so you're actually able to see your community, for my community, the Vietnamese community, that is broken down, and so they're really great numbers to be able to show, exact numbers to show and talk about, and from those numbers, because we serve our Asian community, our Vietnamese and Asian community, we're able to really craft stories out of these data, and one of the things that I guess for me with these data, I feel that this is an opportunity to be able to do more advocacy with our partners, with a lot of the agencies here in Houston. We actually had an incident 2 days ago. We were speaking about how 73% of a lot of the residents in Texas were homeowners, but as Katrina had mentioned, that they are mortgage burdened. But at the same time, a lot of these homeowners, are actually, living in mobile homes, or their apartment complex that have been converted over into condos. And so they're living in really low income areas in order to even be homeowners. And the incident had happened just 2 days ago where, where this apartment complex, which they call condos now, there was a fire. And so 14 units were damaged, and 4 of them were Vietnamese families. And the city of Houston was trying so hard to, they called 211, which is a directory where they can at least get a Vietnamese interpreter or someone to kind of help with these Vietnamese families. And she was really surprised that she couldn't connect anyone from the 211 that had a Vietnamese interpreter, when she knew that we were the second largest population in the city of Houston. But she actually finally connected with me, and we had a conversation around that. And of course, we're gonna help the families, but we had the conversation around the fact is that if we're the second largest population, then why staffing at these agencies or organizations don't have a bilingual worker there? Or why aren't the materials? Because Red Cross actually gave them what they call a red book to kind of help them what they need to do, after a fire. And of course, none of them even understood English or read the book. And I had also talked to American Red Cross because they're handling these cases. And he had mentioned that, I said, I'm really surprised that you guys don't have it translated in Vietnamese, and they were really surprised also. And so in seeing that, in real time, realizing that we really do have a lot of work to do. The data is there, but I think there's so much more work to do to really educate our community partners, our local agencies, that if we have the largest Asian population, the accessibility to resources and information is still not there. So I found that to be, really disappointing. And I think that this report would be very important moving forward to really educate everyone to really understand, the real needs in the community and the population, and helping, and I think working with them to really provide those resources. I think it's going to take a collaborative effort to really make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for shedding that light in the fact that there is data that exists, but now how do we go to the next step in terms of educating the community and educating folks to make sure that the community does have access to these resources. And with that, I would love to invite Sina to kind of share out next, mainly from her organizer hat, and from what Jeanette was sharing about how we're seeing this impact on the ground, but we're still needing a lot of community education. It's going to really take a collaborative effort to see some changes. So from your hat as a community organizer out in Washington, for you, when you looked at this report, was there any data you found particularly compelling or useful in the work that you do in your own community?
Thanks, Katrina. I'm glad to go right after Jeanette with her story sharing. Thank you for having me. And coming from a perspective as an organizer, I would definitely add to the story Jeanette shared in terms of frustrations and being able to, oftentimes with the work we do at CAGE, my anti-deportation advocacy group, we're often having to educate with storytelling of those who are impacted in our community, the Khmer community, in particular, who have faced deportation for 2 decades now, and it's been extremely difficult and such a crisis just within the last couple years under the new administration. ramped up deportations, that when we're interfacing with lawmakers, in particular, we did very heavy campaigning to be able to support and advocate for our families who were impacted in our communities, not just in Washington State, but in collaboration with those across the country and internationally as well, in Cambodia with groups there who give support to the deportees. What was a really important piece right off the bat to be able to do advocacy and then organizing is to have data and information to put into to go along with the personal stories, because we'll want to tap into media and make sure that there is accurate information that is shared for just the sake of legitimizing information, and also making sure it's consistent. And so having a report such as this profile of disaggregated data for our communities, and especially for Washington State, we were definitely able to be more effective as organizers, because the data, when it comes to all of the disproportionate impact of barriers our community faces, and with incoming threat now and concern with the Laotian community and the Hmong community potentially facing increased deportations too, this is a timely report to be able to draw that information right off the bat for the community to be armed with, because we know, coming from Khmer organizers in the last 2 decades, this information is so important, and it's taking us a very long time to be able to put together almost separately, individually, as grassroots organizations, tapping into what we could. And so now learning from the many years of what makes a successful campaign, and winning the hearts and minds of also our community members requires a certain amount of dexterity with understanding the needs of our community, but also the importance of legitimate and reliable data. When we're arming impacted families and impacted community members with why they're probably in the situation they are, with that history, and saying you're not alone. There's a lot of us in our community facing language accessibility issues growing up, that we have. A lot of us are growing up in the communities that are under-resourced or historically undercounted in the census, for instance, which has a direct impact of translated materials as well. In Seattle, where the 3rd largest population of Cambodian Americans are located, we are not yet an official group, because our numbers don't meet the threshold yet for automatic translation in the city. And so that's a piece where just going from census data, having disaggregated data in the next 10 years, I can already foresee will put us in a better place when we can have the leverage to be able to lobby our lawmakers and change policies to help out, and issues that are compounded to kind of impact us on a much more heavier devastation level, because like Katrina mentioned, in terms of targeting for deportation, where we have higher ratio in comparison to very similar other immigrant groups who are facing targeting as well. And so knowing that information has really helped our organization and my team to feel empowered and to educate and to be able to train those who want to also do what we do. So that I there's a lot of compelling information in there that can be used. But I think for the issue of deportation that Cage works on, it's important in terms of knowing what our population is, the history that has led into why our community members are in the situation of being deported.
Thank you so much, Sina. And I really appreciated your reflection on how powerful it is to arm some of these families that are impacted by deportation and really arming them with this data and knowledge and how powerful that could really be. And with that, I wanted to invite Vamala to respond to this question last, and I think it's actually a good connection. So Vamala is on the board of LANA, which is a national organization, and we know that their organization has been having to respond to this issue of deportation. They've been getting a number of responses from community members. But Vamala, from your perspective, as a board member of LANA, were there particular data points that you found compelling, and I guess what are you most excited about when it comes to this report?
Sure. Thanks, Katrina, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vamala Pongson. I work in DC, and Rhode Island is home. And so I thank SEARAC and Advancing Justice LA for publishing this important report, and to all my other co-conspirators on the panel as well. I, as Katrina mentioned, serve on the board of LANA, and I also serve as the organizing director of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. The center brings together unions, community organizers, digital organizers, policy wonks, advocates, and everyday people from every corner of the progressive movement to win the real changes that we need to survive and to thrive. What I'm most excited about in this report is, as a child of Lao refugees, this report rings true to me. It tells a critically important story of the incredible resilience of Southeast Asian American community in the ways that our policy systems have failed us, including the deportation that Katrina had mentioned, and from the ways our immigration system leaves refugees vulnerable to deportation, to glaring disparities in health and education outcomes. A lot of people talk about the importance of API representation, and for Lao people, we're an underrepresented group within an underrepresented group. And so I'm excited about this report to use it to build our community's infrastructure and our organizing capacity. And as this report shows, Lao people are young and a growing community, and we have so much potential to create something special together, even in moments of despair, to build our power, to create our own narrative, and to make our stories heard. And I see so much potential for the untapped political power in our community. One of your data points was that nationally, the states with the fastest growing Southeast Asian populations are red states. So there's Alaska, and I think of Senator Murkowski, who had, voted no against impeachment and played a critical role in Kavanaugh confirmation. West Virginia, another red state. Nevada, which is kind of blue. Wyoming, a red state. Arizona, a red state. And the largest Lao population, Tennessee, a red state. Texas, a red state. I see a lot of untapped political power. Our democracy was on life support before this administration, and we've seen recently that it has become worse. And it's very easy to become cynical about it, but we have to still believe that every vote matters. Too many people have suffered and sacrificed for us not to believe it. And so, I'm a true believer in that all politics is local. We hold the power. Our votes put people into elected positions. We give these people the power to make decisions about our lives. We should be courted by every elected official that wants our vote. And we need a government that really works for us, not just the powerful. And so we have a lot of potential to build this as a community. We can fight for bold policies and fight to make them a reality, and to really make our communities a better place. And we need to get our folks, registered to vote, applying for citizenship. And when I really do want to, in my position at LANA, make our communities really believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. I've seen it firsthand in my own election when I ran for school committee in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Me and my dad registered 100 new Lao voters in the community that I grew up in, and we brought them to the polls, and we won that election by 61 votes. And so there's so much potential in building political power for our communities, and everyone can play a role in it, whether you can vote or you can't. And so, so I think that's the potential I see in this data, and how to figure out how we can move forward with it. And with Lana, you know, we do have a big focus this year on the census and also getting people out to vote, because every vote matters, especially at the local level where a lot of decisions are being made that are affecting our communities directly. In the report, I found some of the data points that I found pretty interesting were that Lao people have a 14% college graduation rate compared to 50% of APIs. And I know Katrina mentioned the model minority myth, and you know, that just disaggregated data point is so important because it tells a story for our community. The other point was that 30% of Lao people don't have a high school diploma compared to 14% of APIs. That's more than double, and I think that's really unacceptable and something that that we should really put a high alert on. And so we need to find other APIs to be better allies for our communities. You know, don't just talk about us. Don't make decisions for us if we're not at the table. Demand that we're at the table. Don't have conversations about us if none of us are there. Our education system needs to reflect students and communities it serves. We need to be at the table when hirings are being made, when curricula are being decided, when education leaders are being chosen. We need ethnic studies for our students to learn about their own history, because, you know, a paragraph about the Vietnam War is not enough. Our students need to learn about the secret war in Laos, the Khmer Rouge. We need to be seen, heard. Our stories are powerful. And we also need more resources for the groups that are already doing the great work on the ground. In addition to that, we need more resources, better programming for our newest Americans, like ESL classes, citizenship classes, civic classes, job training programs, and so that our families can be self-sufficient and sustainable when they get to this country. On the uninsured rate, I found the data to be compelling also. I used to work at a direct service agency serving Southeast Asians in Rhode Island. When the Affordable Care Act rolled out, we saw many people get healthcare coverage for the very first time. The Affordable Care Act was a great first step to getting people health coverage, but still people of color make up a disproportionate amount of the uninsured. 59% of uninsured Americans are people of color. Lack of healthcare leads to over 40,000 deaths a year, hitting communities of color, including Southeast Asians, particularly hard. I've seen community members struggle with outrageous medical bills, elders who skip their annual check-ins because they can't afford copay, neighbors whose medication can cost, in excess of $3,000 per dose. And I'm sure a lot of folks have a story about someone they know or someone in their family in this situation. It really shouldn't be cliche that people have to resort to begging on GoFundMe to afford a life-saving surgery for their for-profit insurance company denied them. And so 66% of all bankruptcies are caused by medical debt. And so our communities are really at risk of this. And I have heard too many horror stories about this. Today's actually the anniversary of Medicare for All being introduced in the House, so I'd like to plug that. Medicare for All does guarantee healthcare as a basic human right to all people in the U.S. Everyone would automatically get enrolled, and coverage moves with every person no matter what. And so Medicare for All would make a huge stride in addressing racial disparities in our communities, especially against Southeast Asian communities. My last point on this question is about economic justice. The report shows that Lao people are earning around $18,000 per year, 17% living in poverty, and 24% being categorized as low income. Both of my parents started working in factories on their second day in this country. They barely spoke English and barely understood the norms of a new country. And my mom earned the minimum wage at a factory for 35 years until her retirement last year. She worked sometimes 16-hour days so that she could provide for me and my family. I know this is a story that all of us can relate to. My dad was a unionized machinist until his retirement last year, and I saw a huge difference in their quality of life from someone who was unionized and someone who wasn't. And so we do need to talk more about economic justice for our communities. How do we get better data on the breakdown of industry that Southeast Asian folks are in, and the breakdown of who's unionized or not. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Vamala. I appreciate your reflections specifically around, I guess, forward thinking around, you know, it's an election year, it's also a census year, and how are we making sure that our communities are coming out and being counted and making sure that they're voting, and how that important that is, and how key that is really for any systemic change that we want to be seeing. So with that, I am mindful that it's almost 4 o'clock, but for folks, hopefully can stick on for just a few more minutes. We did want to allow community members and folks on the line to ask any questions. We probably have maybe 5 minutes left if folks wanted to ask questions of the panelists or the SEARAC team. We also have June on the phone from Advancing Justice if folks have any specific sort of data questions. But wanted to open it up if folks have questions. You can either message it through GoToWebinar, or you can raise your hand through the GoToWebinar panel and we can unmute you. So let's see if we have any questions coming in. Any last call for questions? And if none, there is one kind of, oh, there is a question. So this question is from Tommy. He's asking if there's any studies on mixed Laotian populations. And I think I can pump that over to June, since she did most of the data and research on this. June, did you come across anything along that nature, or maybe mixed populations in general within the Southeast Asian community? June, are you still on the line by any chance?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't look at that that kind of data in particular, but I can see if that's available. There might be some, but it's not going to break it down like specifically as to like different types. It might just be like Laotian and other mixed. So I could see if there's anything available, I'd be happy to provide my contact information if you wanted to reach me directly, and we could see what we could find.
Thank you so much, June. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe usually when we look at population data through ACS, isn't it usually like, for example, Lao and in any combination, not just folks that identify as purely Lao?
Exactly. So you have that combination, but it doesn't tell you what the combination is when you just pull it from ACS data. So that's kind of the limitations of that. I can see if there's in the PUMS data, if there might be more specific like mixed identities, but I would need to look at the data specifically to see that in terms of like what the detail as to like what the combination might be. So I'll have to look at the data for that.
Thank you so much, June. We have someone who raised their hand, and we can go ahead and unmute you if you want to ask your question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Tran. I'm Vietnamese Cambodian, born in Austin, Texas. I currently live in New York City. I do a lot of Asian American youth development and activism here. I have a question about, so Vanilla, am I saying your name right? Vamala. yeah, you said something about how there's a lot of untapped political power within our community, and I completely agree with you. What do you think, how can we move forward and cultivate young leaders into politics? Like, do you have any thoughts or ideas? I've heard so many people tell me that I should run for office, but I really don't know if I can, or if, like, what is the pathway there, because I don't have like someone I can, I guess, look up to or learn from.
Yep. No, that's a great question. There are many trainings if you are ever interested in that, to learn more about that in the process of running for office, because it can be daunting, right? It's a lot, but I think there are a lot of trainings that if you reach out to me, my email is Vimala, Vimala, at progressivecaucuscenter.org. I could send you a list of resources where you can learn more about that part. For your first part of the question about how do we engage younger people, I think, you know, in everything I've done, it's really about creating a culture that people want to be a part of. So making voting fun, making democracy fun, even though sometimes it may not seem fun. It's about tapping into people in what their interests are, even. And so what I did with my campaign to get the Lao community involved, which, you know, they weren't usually really engaged at all. I've had some people who came up to me and said, this is the first time I've ever voted, and I've been in this country for over 40 years. And it's, you know, finding roles for them. So in my campaign, we had a lot of volunteers who were from the community. Some of them would cook egg rolls. Some of them would do preparing packages to go door knocking. And so it's, again, it's building that community that people want to be a part of. And with Lana, what we're doing is working to engage younger board members as well. And we recruited 3 amazing new board members who are talented in all sorts of ways, but wanting to, again, you know, create a place for them, a space for them to learn and grow as well. But civic engagement is, there are a lot of groups doing the work, and I can definitely send you a list if you are interested in running for office or even learning more about that, of trainings that are out there.
Thank you, Vimala. Okay, with that, unfortunately, we are very over time. If folks do have follow-up questions, my email will be at the end of the slides, and I can filter them on to our speakers if folks have particular questions for those speakers. I think we'll skip this poll question. I did want to leave just 1 minute to Gina to give a quick plug about our upcoming LET program, specific to the question on how can we start engaging young people to be excited about civic engagement. I feel like LET might be a good start.
Definitely. So, hi everyone. Just here to quickly talk about and plug up our upcoming LET, which stands for Leadership and Advocacy Training. It's a program that we put on every year. It's 3 days in Washington, D.C., where we teach leaders within the SEAA community all around the country how to storytell, how to frame their stories effectively, and communicate the issues that their community face to legislative offices, culminating in a visit on Capitol Hill with your congressional representative's office. So you can apply those skills that you learn at LET to the people that are in charge of making legislative decisions for your community. So I highly encourage everyone on this call to apply for LET by March 12th. And you can see on your screen that there is a link right there. That's let2020app.paperform.co. So feel free to send in your applications by that date. And if you have any more questions, feel free to send me an email at Gina, Gina, at SEARAC.org, or visit the link on your screen, which is SEARAC.org/LET.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, to our community members who participated. We really hope this was an informative call, and that we hope that you find this report helpful in the work that you do in your own communities. You can download our report on our website, as well as hopefully folks had access through GoToWebinar. We also have our March community call coming up. You can see the link on your screen, bit.ly/SEARAC March 2020 CC. If you have any questions on this or any other future community calls, I've left my email as well as Sina's. I didn't list the speakers' emails, but if folks have particular questions for them, feel free to email us and we can definitely direct you to them. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this Thursday afternoon, and we will catch you on our next community call, hopefully. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.